Please stand for the U.S. National Anthem. Please welcome President and Chief Executive Officer, Atlantic Council, Frederick Kemp.
Can I explain that? First of all, I want to say to our Indonesian guests, we had every intention of playing your national anthem first, and we will correct this by tomorrow morning, but our band unfortunately didn't know how to play it. I just want you to know that this will be the last moment of American hubris, and tomorrow morning, when we start our larger session with a much bigger crowd, we'll address that. So I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure today to kick off our first day of programming at the Atlantic Council's first ever Global Food Security Forum as an official sideline event of the G20 Summit here in Bali. So the Atlantic Council's mission for 60 years has been to galvanize constructive U.S. leadership alongside partners and allies to shape the future. The mission is old, but the relationship for us in Indonesia is new. The Atlantic Council in many ways is a misnomer geographically because we've been the Global Atlantic Council for some time with programs and centers that span interests around the globe wherever we have partners and allies working to shape the future. We're known as a think tank. I've never liked the term. We're more of an action tank. We like actors, practitioners, scholars like you who want to come here not just to hear speeches, but to come up with ideas, come up with recommendations, come up with solutions for a better world, and in this case, particularly with food security. And so I'm delighted in that spirit to convene such an accomplished group of local, regional, and international leaders across government, business, civil society, media, for today's series of roundtable discussions on global food security. For those that are joining us virtually, and this is an on-record session, we also have a virtual global audience. This will also be recast for people at sometimes better hour for the region. But we welcome you all, and you can follow along with the hashtag Atlantic Council Food Security. So the hashtag on Twitter, Atlantic Council Food Security. We're still using Twitter. We're not sure we'd invest in it, but I'd like to first acknowledge and thank our forum co-hosts, including the Ministry of Defense and coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Investment of the Republic of Indonesia, for their partnership and hospitality in organizing this conference. So a huge thanks to Minister Prabowo Subianto and Minister Luhut Binsar Panjaitan, who will speak to us tomorrow, in sessions tomorrow and keynotes tomorrow. I most of all want to thank, sitting to my left, my seat next to me and the seat next to him, Gaurav and Sharon Srivastava of the Gaurav and Sharon Srivastava Foundation, our former co-host and underwriting partner. So Gaurav and Sharon, thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your vision. Thank you for your generosity. We quite literally would not be here without you, so thank you so much for that. I also want to salute someone I've just respected for many years for his service to our country and for his intellectual leadership, General Wes Clark, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, of NATO, and member and the senior member attending this conference of the Atlantic Council Board of Directors. He is here as our board leader and was a driving force between this impressive conference. Where are you, Wes? Here we go. General Clark. I'm very briefly going to preview what you can expect over the next 2 days. Today we'll engage in 2 roundtable discussions on the state of global food security and challenges involved. These sessions will allow us to delve into the topic deeply and in a little bit more of an expert manner, drilling a little deeper than perhaps we'll do tomorrow, and lay the groundwork for tomorrow's programming, which will feature a diverse set of keynotes, fireside chats, and panel discussions, expanding on the topics we addressed today. Not only will we have Minister Prabowo and Minister LaHood, we'll also have the U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer joining us virtually, a couple of members of Congress, so it's going to be a very strong day. And then lastly, and we hope you'll all be here for the close tomorrow evening, we're going to close the conference with an exclusive concert for those who are attending our conference with the celebrated singer-songwriter John Legend, who has, they call him an EGOT awarded singer-songwriter. That means he's won the Emmy, he's won the Grammy, he's won the Golden Globe, he's won the Oscar, he's won the Tony. It's extraordinary that we'll have him tomorrow playing beside Indonesian singer-songwriter Sandi Sondoro. I think all of you from Indonesia know him well. And the U.S. Air Force Band of the Pacific, which you heard up behind us today. So it's truly an extraordinary way to conclude these 2 days. Global food security sits at the nexus of the world's most pressing challenges as food security rises, threatened by near-term shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic, Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, and long-term risks of climate change and sustained conflict. Ending world hunger will require enhanced public-private cooperation and wide-ranging innovation in agriculture, technology, finance, and policy. Putin's weaponization of food security in the last year has underscored that food security has got to be discussed together with energy security, with military security, with all aspects of international and national security. One cannot deal with it separately. Today's workshop roundtables serve as a venue for and driver of this cooperation. The goal of these discussions is to allow all of you an opportunity to delve into food security challenges and solutions in this smaller setting than tomorrow, laying the groundwork for our second day. At the end of the conference, we will be distilling insights from our meetings and collecting them into a memo and concrete recommendations for leaders at the G20 Summit and beyond. So as you make your comments, as you make your statements, as you raise your questions, keep in mind what in there might be a notion that we might want to put a pin in as an idea for action. Our challenge to each of you is to help us identify these concrete solutions and recommendations that we today can turn to policy action. So an action tank, not a think tank. I want to remind everyone that this session is on the record and is being live streamed for a public audience. If you wish to speak or provide comments, raise your hand and we will pass you a microphone. And now, before we get started, I'd like to turn to Gaurav for a few remarks And let me thank you once again for your vision and your support of this wonderful gathering.
Thank you, Fred. Excellencies, members, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and warmest greetings. On behalf of our devoted planners, partners, facilitators, and my courageous wife and life partner, Sharon, we welcome you. We welcome you with open arms and optimistic hearts. I am emboldened to see so many familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and my extended global family and cherished community, united in a singularly imperative mission to end the pain and suffering of all human beings. A mission that must succeed. I would like to thank the Atlantic Council, Fed Campe, and his unrivaled team. Thank you. Their perseverance, resolve, and commitment to making this momentous event a reality. I would like to thank our other partners, the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Indonesia, and the Coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the Investment of the Republic of Indonesia for making this forum possible. I would also like to thank my dear friend Hashim for making this event possible. Thank you. There are innumerable challenges facing our planet, our citizens, and our way of life. Obstacles that threaten to breach and undermine our most basic core human values, to overshadow our proudest achievements, to completely replace peace, love, and benevolence with war, hate, and indefensible cruelty. An affront to everything as we as human beings are. Time and time again, it's been said, we cannot and we will not let this happen. And still, as we gather today, desperate men, women, and innocent children from all four corners of the globe are facing food insecurity, driven to the brink of starvation, suffering, robbed of dignity, respect, and hope. But the question is, how can this be? How can this abomination, this seismic crisis of inhumanity, continue to blight the existence of even one global citizen? We know the contributing factors far too well. The social and economic root causes, the vicious cycles of poverty, inequity, and bloody conflicts, which only serve to divide and destroy. These unrivaled problems need expedited solutions. These complex questions demand pragmatic answers. And that's why we have come from far and wide to shoulder the burden of blame together, to share the responsibility of rectifying our wrongs, to harness the conviction and tenacity of our most brilliant minds and leaders, and tirelessly work together to restore the sanctity of human race, to ensure peace and prosperity for everyone. This forum, these workshops, are about discovery and discourse, about difficult conversations that must be had. The conflict in Ukraine, the ramifications of COVID-19, the catastrophic market shocks, and the critical interconnectivity of food and energy. That reminds us we must work together. Ladies and gentlemen, the goal is clear, the stakes immeasurable, the mandate divine. Thank you and Godspeed.
Good afternoon,
Introduce yourself.
ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adam Schwarz. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy at the Atlantic Council and CEO of Asia Group Advisors, a public affairs firm focused on Southeast Asia. I'd like to add my welcome to that of Fred's and Gaurav's to everybody here to join us on this opening panel of the Global Food Security Conference, and thank Fred and Gaurav for pulling us all together today on this very important topic. I want to just spend a little time just kind of on a format for today. As you can see, we've got quite a large group today. We don't have any prepared remarks or opening remarks planned on the schedule. So what I'd like to do is start with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions. Feel free to raise your hand. I'll do my best to keep track of the sequence in which the hands were raised. Given that we do have such a large number of people in the room, I would ask if people could keep their remarks relatively brief, 2 or 3 minutes, if you can, and we'll try to give as many people an opportunity to speak as we can. In terms of sequence, as Fred was saying, what we'd like to do with this opening panel is to lay out a number of the challenges, and there are obviously quite a few with food security at the moment, and then move into a discussion of solutions and recommendations to be sort of added to the list that we hope to get to by the end of this 2-day conference. Let me then, if I may, start with Pa Hashim, who has done so much to make this event happen. And Pa Hashim, let me just sort of ask you your thoughts. You know, what sort of drove you to bring this event here? Why is it so important for us to have this event on food security in Indonesia at this stage?
Adam, thanks very much for addressing your remarks to me and addressing your question to me. I think the major reason for my involvement in this forum and the efforts to bring this about is because it's because of Indonesia's increasing interdependence on global markets. You know, I think many people are very surprised, especially Europeans and North Americans, as to the effect of the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine war, on countries as far away as Indonesia. But one statistic, it comes out very glaringly, is the fact that Indonesia imports, I think this year, 14 million tons of wheat. 14 million tons of wheat. Indonesia produces very, very little wheat. I think it's 0 tonnage. And therefore, anything that happens in faraway places, such as Ukraine, has a direct impact on the livelihoods of Indonesians. And I understand, and somebody asked me, why is the Ministry of Defense of Indonesia involved in this forum? It's because many of Indonesia's 500,000 soldiers depend on what we call Indomie, which is the instant noodles, for their food supply every day. So any negative impact on prices would have a direct impact on the soldiers of the Indonesian Armed Forces and the wider population. So this is, you know, the primary reason why I got involved, and any impact on wheat prices has another impact on other commodities, other food, corn, sorghum, rice, and has a knock-on impact. So that's primarily the reason why I got involved. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much, Pa Hashim. And let me now turn, given that obviously what's been happening in Ukraine is such an important part of this discussion we're having today, I'd like to turn to Kira Rudik. If you would maybe just ask you kind of the same question. In your view, why just lay out for us why you think this is such a critical issue for us to deal with today?
Hello, everyone. I'm Kira Rudik, member of Ukrainian Parliament, a leader of the Liberal Party Holos, and it's my pleasure to be here today. It's 9 months since the full-scale invasion by Russia on my country started. And it may seem as literally another side of the earth from here, but one of the things and one of the lessons that this war teaches us is how connected we are to each other, how dependent we are on each other, and how fragile are the connections that are between us. Before the war started, my country was top 5 world's largest exporters of wheat, grains, sunflower oil, tomatoes, and corn. Right now, my country, whose one of the missions is to feed the world, has so much complications in doing so. The ability to provide to the whole world is essential and critical for us. And the war would definitely affect the food security, not only in the countries that have the direct connections with Ukraine, but all the countries in the whole world. Since the beginning of full-scale invasion, the food prices, the grain prices have gone up 30%. And the issue is that it is not only this year that would be affected, because you can imagine that it is very hard to plant wheat during the bombarding and to get the harvest during the bombarding. To have the territory of Ukraine, our huge lands mined, and where we were supposed to provide for the life, there is death right now. And this is killing us. This is killing us as a people of purpose, as people who are there to continue being the breadbasket of the whole world. There is a grain deal, an ability to export the grains from Ukraine using the ports. It is incredibly important because one of the worst things that could be for a farmer, and you can imagine that, is to see grains rotting in the silos. So that's a fantastic one, but it is such a fragile agreement. Every single moment, the ship is going in and out. It's so many people having fingers crossed or praying, because you never know if it's going to reach its destination. So what kind of food security is there if it's absolutely not secure? So for any discussion about security and about ability for my country to continue to provide for the whole world, we should start with the question of peace. We should start with the question of victory. We should start with the question of predictability. We should start with the question of security, because food security comes as add-on to the general security. And the impact of what is going on right now, we will see moving further down the road. Because even during the war, Ukrainian farmers were able to get onto 80% of their suggested harvest. But we do not know what will happen next year and the year after. We will do our best, because this is one of the missions of my country. But would we be able to do so? That depends on the support of the international community that we are asking for. Help us, help you. Help us to provide to you. Help us complete our mission. Feed the whole world. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.
Okay.
So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for your heroism, and thank you for the heroism of the Ukrainians. We also, at the Atlantic Council, want Russia to find its way into a Europe whole and free over time. That is our goal. We did invite Russians to attend today, and we regret that they aren't here. But in any case, Kira, that's a wonderful statement, and thank you for putting this into context. Russia and Ukraine together provide a third of the world's wheat. And so Hashem talked about wheat, that's where it comes from, so much of it. So let me pass back to Adam to continue the moderation, and I think we have a special guest.
Fred, thank you very much. I would like to acknowledge Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto, who has just joined us. Welcome, sir. And if I may ask you to say a few words to the group. Obviously, defense is and the security implications of the food crisis. Would you prefer to talk tomorrow? Yes, very good. Very good. We'll continue on then. So what I thought we might turn to next, after talking about the specific country level that we just talked about, was talking a little bit kind of the regional differences on how the food security challenge is impacting different parts of the world. And I'd like to ask two people to sort of address that. The first is Chinfeng Zhang from the Asian Development Bank, and the second would be General Wesley Clark. So, Mr. Zhang, could I ask you to begin, please? Well, I'm going to start with Chinfeng.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. First, I very honor you guys invite the Asian Development Bank to attend this very important forum. In terms of the regional difference of food insecurity, three things I want to highlight. Even before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, this region already suffering from the political conflict, including Afghanistan, Myanmar. The very deep food insecurity already taking place. And also this region, of course, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, climate change also have the big impact in this region. You just look at the floods, droughts, landslides, all of them affect the food insecurity. And you look at what happened in Pakistan this year, the floods and also droughts and the heat wave in India. And of course, the droughts in the Yangtze River was a significant effect on the food security. And again, just like our Indonesia counterpart just mentioned about it, the Russia invasion of the Ukraine basically escalate, the food insecurity risk. Many of our countries, and these 13 countries heavily rely on import of the wheat, fertilizer from Russia and also the Ukraine. So when we come to the what we need to do, I think is no single blueprint, but three things are very, very important. Number one, is the demand side management. Two is the supply side. Third is the logistics. So I want to just quickly share, in September, IDB just announced $14 billion food security plan to address the three issues. Of course, the first one, short term, we're going to provide the social protection, social safety net, address and support the vulnerable people. The second, of course, is from long term, from the supply side to support the climate resilient agriculture, digitalization of a value chain, and then the nature-based solutions. Finally, one thing we need to learn from the 2008 food crisis, that's we need to keep the trade free and open. But unfortunately, this year you can see, even in this region, about the 20 countries still introduce trade restrictions. So I think through this global discussions, we need to continue promote the open trade regional cooperation, particularly for fertilizer. Probably let me just stop here. I think tomorrow, we will have the chance to continue the discussions. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much, Chinfeng. General Clark, your sense of how the food security challenge is impacting different parts of the world?
Well, thank you, Adam. First of all, I think the problem between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the consequent shutdown of exports from Ukraine through the Black Sea has brought global attention to the food security issue. But it's overdue attention. This is not a problem of one event. This is a problem that has been building for several decades now. To the immediate issue, of course, those shipping routes need to be opened in the Black Sea, and they need to stay open. The farmers in Ukraine need to be able to plant, to fertilize, to harvest, and market. At the same time, Russia also must export grain and fertilizer and get the world agricultural system back in check. But as Hashim noted earlier, this is a deeper problem because really populations have grown, consumer preferences are evolving, and as the global South increases in development, it wants to eat the same food as the global North. And yet these lands don't support the same crops. So Hashim, you're mentioning the 40 million tons of wheat being imported. Yes, and this is representative of the problem all across the global South. We've enjoyed the chocolates and coffee that come from tropical countries, but they could be producing millet and other grains. They could be subsisting and living on cassava, which can be grown there, rather than importing wheat. But the global economy has knitted us together in such a way through these global supply chains, population growth, and changing consumer preferences that we've built a system that's so interconnected. It's so efficient in terms of just-in-time delivery that any shock causes perturbations. Perturbations like rising prices. And of course, that hits the lower income the most difficult. It hits countries in North Africa and East Africa the hardest because they need the grain imports the most right now. But it really is a global issue. It's hitting people in South America. It's hitting the American consumer. It's exacerbated by energy, because when the price of natural gas rises, then the price of fertilizer rises. When the price of oil rises, then the costs of shipping go up. So everything is connected here. Thomas Malthus, over 200 years ago, predicted population would explode geometrically, but food production could not keep up. And every few decades, someone reinvents Malthusian economics and says it's over. So when I was a young man growing up, the world population was 2 billion. People said it can't possibly support 5 billion. I was at the Millikan conference 10 years ago when we crested 7 billion. 7 billion, and now we're at 8 billion. And yet, what's happened is technology has enabled us to provide food and even better nutrition. But we've done so with the metrics of international finance. And now even international finance is an issue for us, because for over a decade, since the financial shocks of 2008-9, we've had very, very low credit costs. So it was easy to borrow money, create your letters of credit, finance international trade. Well, now the cost of money is going up. It's being driven by the United States' own Federal Reserve System. Now maybe we're going to see it capped at a 4%, 4.5% Fed rate. We don't know yet. But we do know that the financial implications of this are worldwide in terms of what it does to rates of exchange for currency and what it does for the cost of imported food in countries around the world. So it's a very, very complicated, interrelated system. And where it ties in, to me especially in my lifetime, is with the issue of instability and conflict. So we can look at what happened in Syria in 2010. We know that was related to land reform. It was related to an increasing inability of people to buy the food they needed for subsistence as they became urbanized. It was also related, of course, to another factor that we're driving, and that's climate change. So between Syria, the Sahel in Africa, Somalia and East Africa, changing rainfall patterns, everything's in the mix. So what I hope we'll be able to do, Adam, in this workshop is the various experts here will jump in, give us their particular points of view, and then we'll use this to make sure that in the upcoming session tomorrow and for the G20, we don't let political leaders skate over the problem. These are problems. They have to be addressed realistically, not in campaign pledges, but with real programs, real technology, and real financing. Thank you.
Let me, if I may now, turn to Ibu Nani Hendiarti from the Coordinating Minister of Maritime Affairs and Investment. Ibu Nani, if you share some thoughts with us on, from the variety of portfolios that you cover, how is this looming food security issue impacting those portfolios? Thank you.
Thank you, General Winsley. Very good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I think this would like to thanks for this very good event where we see the issue on the food security is very important beside water and energy. So in our national program priority, we say that this food security is the top priority. So, and then we have several programs to support this priority in national priorities, such as the food estate. So we understand, I think we are really see that this agriculture specifically is impacted by two issues. One of these in the context of the climate change, where they have also given impact to the both sides, I think, to the climate itself, where they gave also related with the water, and then also the in terms of the adaptation of the climate change, but also in terms of the mitigations, where we understand the methane is also part of this agriculture sector that we need to give specific attention. So I think in the context of this, we would like to highlight also that this issue will also connect with the rising of the global population and also incomes, as well as the urbanizations are also driving strong and diversified growth in the food. So besides also that link with the food, I think water is also other essential elements of our existence. So for an example, in Java Islands in Indonesia is the most populated island with about almost 150 million of people. That is one of the Indonesian rice producer. So the rapid urbanization in Java boosts water demand for the household and also the industry. That creating also competition with irrigations in important water scarce agriculture region. So I would like then we would like to also raising this issue. So the connected between the three important, especially food and water. I think, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Nani. So let me move now to, not as if the food security challenge is not a significant enough one as it is, but given that we are hosting this conference while COP27 is ongoing, I did want to open the floor and ask a few questions about the intersections of food insecurity and the problems, the logistics problems that we're having globally with the parallel and climate change challenge. And I'd like to begin with Willie Smits, the Chief Science Officer at Arsari Group. Willie, thank you. Can we get a mic in the middle here? Thank you.
Terima kasih. Thank you, Adam. Long time that you came to see the orangutans in East Kalimantan. Yeah, I'm more on the solution-based side of the equation, looking at how we can overcome the problems. So maybe I'd like to go into that there is actually hope. We are looking at, indeed, the interconnections between climate and food security. We see shifting climate zones. We see forests dying off in Siberia, in Canada, and as a result, we have very big emissions of CO2, and we have land use changes. So all of those are also going to impact what crops can be produced where, what diseases, what pests will be impacting the agricultural productivity. So on a worldwide scale, these interconnections are more than obvious with the shifting climate zones that we are facing. But there are also local solutions that need to be sought in the tropics. Here in the tropics, we have the most stable climatological conditions, and we can create agroforests. And agroforests, they can provide all the services that the people need. They can provide the food security, they can provide materials, they can provide energy, they regulate the local climate, they absorb vast amounts of CO2. We can produce biochar from all the waste materials that can be absorbed in the soil in quantities that are much, much higher than what we face at the moment in the atmosphere. So we can actually reduce the risk of fires, we can create more jobs. In that way, we can reduce the impact upon remaining forests, we can increase biodiversity. But those systems are not turnkey because they are complicated. People need know-how. People need to integrate various technologies and plants. But if you understand about nature and you see how nature has regenerated soil, then it is possible to do so. There's things like the fungi on the roots of the trees that produce a substance called glomalin and that can fix the soil, prevent erosion, store again carbon. So really, those are the ways to go. We should go away from this monoculture attitude, which is actually gambling and is much more susceptible to pests and diseases, and as they are influenced by climate change worldwide. So I think more attention for the mixed systems and the real solutions. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Let me, and that's a good beginning segue into the solution part of our conversation. But before we get there, I did want to table one or two other issues or challenges. And perhaps we can now turn to sort of the politics and geopolitics. We have with us today Peter Engelke, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Nicole Golden, who have been looking at this issue from the Atlantic Council from both a political and an economic perspective. I'd like to ask each of you to sort of share your thoughts from those different perspectives, how you see these emerging and probably increasing implications from the food security challenge that we're facing. Peter, can you start with you?
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for joining with the Atlantic Council here today and tomorrow. We're delighted that this event is upon us. So I run our foresight practice at the Atlantic Council, which means that we take the idea of sort of longer timescales. We take that seriously, and so to answer the question about sort of where are we headed when we look at food and its relationship to geopolitics, I mean, I think it might be appropriate to look at where we've been historically. And where we've been, frankly, is that in the long sweep of human history is that if you look at city-states, nations, empires, et cetera, that food and geopolitics have been incredibly intertwined over the longer sweep of our history through cities, states, nations, empires, trying to secure supplies of food stable supplies of food through domestic production, through trade and diplomacy, but also through, and this is the critical point, I think, through conquest and through warfare. And that food has been both a source and a consequence of conflict and warfare for much of our species' history. States have sought to deny their rivals access to food, and as well as the territory upon which the food is produced. And as a result of that, of course, individuals have suffered greatly. We've already heard about that this morning. Hunger and famine have been, of course, the twinned results of that conflict over time. If you flash to the world that we live in now, you flash forward, we've been living in a really pretty benign relationship, if you're talking about geopolitics on the one hand and food on the other, since really the end of the Second World War. Until not that long ago, we could make a claim that the modern global food system has been a real improvement over the history that I just described. I mean, we have had, as we've heard this morning, an open global trading system plus a very tech and energy-intensive system that has meant that we've been able to dramatically increase the amount of food that we can produce globally. This is per General Clark's point earlier about how we can get from feeding 2 billion people to now 8 billion people in the world, and therefore defeat Malthus in the process. The system, of course, is not perfect, never has been. There's all kinds of problems with it, as we've also heard this morning. But nonetheless, that linkage between food and geopolitics has been a little bit more sedate in the post-Second World War period. And then we come to this year, right? We come to 2022, and we see, of course, the impact of the war in Ukraine, which, as we've already heard this morning, that conflict can, in fact, have real global repercussions on the question of food, and the relationship, therefore, between food and sort of power in the world. It also reinforces, as we've also heard this morning, that the global food system that we built, upon which we relied, also a point that General Clark made earlier about the efficiency of that system. That efficiency of that system is highly vulnerable to disruption. There are only a relatively small number of breadbaskets in the world, and if you choke off one or more of those through drought, through flooding, through warfare, you can actually have real and unfortunate impacts on the world. In addition to the high dependence that we have on energy and the energy system. And if you add to all of this what I call ecology's long shadow, which is not just climate change, it's biodiversity and the problems that come with both of those things, we're entering into a world that I would characterize as more geopolitical risk surrounding food rather than less. And that I don't think has characterized the world that we've inhabited for a very long time. So if we look ahead, we're looking at sources of risk between the relationship between food on the one hand, geopolitics on the other, that arise from climate shocks, right, that the severe drought and flooding, heat waves, et cetera, that we've seen in the world over the last few years, that are becoming more common. It's going to continue to be more common in the future. The impacts, of course, are going to be negative on food production. And as a result, therefore, you're going to get impacts on fragility, state fragility around the world. And therefore, you're going to get the spillover consequences from that. You're going to get more conflict in localized areas. You're going to get forced outmigration and more. And then, of course, you've got a series of geopolitical shocks that arise from all of this, including the increased risk of hoarding and protectionism, even by major states in the system, and of course the specter, frankly, of conflicts over food between states, which we've been largely spared from in the post-Second World War period. And then the last source of risk I would point out would be really the risk that the global governance system is not going to keep up with the demand for solutions, right? That we know, looking at the interstate system, that it's not easy to arrive at global solutions through global agreements. And as a result, there is a real possibility that despite the scale of this challenge, that like, for example, thus far with climate change, we may run the risk of not being able to address this problem through multilateral solutions. And then on top of all of this, I think it's also important to point out that we're trying to decarbonize the energy system at the very same time, that very same energy system that feeds, quite literally, the global food system. And I know that I don't want to go too much longer, but I want to say that the future is not lost, despite what I just said. There is quite a bit of room for optimism. We've heard that from a number of speakers, and that's why we're all here, because we believe in that. The first is, of course, there is enormous space for innovation. We've been innovating our way out of the Malthus trap for 2 centuries, and that's going to continue. We have speakers here at this conference who are going to be speaking directly to the ways in which we can innovate, not just through technology, but through approaches to how we harvest food and grow food. The second, of course, is that there is, in fact, always cooperation for global governance, including at forums like the G20, right? That human beings possess agency and states possess agency, and that we need to remember that. It may be hard, it may be difficult, it may be really difficult to tackle so-called wicked problems, but it can be done. And then finally, we can, in fact, diversify the production challenges that we just heard about and to make the global food system more resilient by geography, in other words, create more bread baskets around the world, by commodity to reduce our dependence on just a few small numbers of seed varieties in the world, and then by type of production. In other words, to go to these kinds of solutions involving agroforestry, more creative sort of aquaculture and the like. And with that, I'll stop.
Nicole, and if I could ask you to keep it a little bit brief, because I want to move us into our solution part of our conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'll just make a couple of additional points and add on to all that Peter and some other folks have said already on what I would say the geopolitical economy dynamics at play. And just picking up a little bit on some of the things we've heard about population hitting 8 billion and some of the demographic issues and how those play into the geopolitical economy, is that in addition to thinking about these at the kind of country and the broad macro level, it's also really about people, right, at the community and even in the household level. And so when we think about those geopolitical economy dynamics, I think we also want to make sure, as we're getting into the solutions conversation, that we're recognizing that not all people in not all places are affected equally. So we talked a little bit about some of the regional distinctions, but we would, I think, be remiss if we didn't acknowledge and bring into the conversation the fact that women and young people are in particularly often disproportionately impacted by the food crisis, women and children in particular. And so how we think about that in terms of household dynamics, I think is really critical. We talked a little bit about region. I was pleased to hear the coordinator bring up urbanization, because again, those urban food insecurity issues are often not as prominent in the conversation or in the solutions conversation. So we really need to think about those rural-urban linkages and those dynamics, particularly as they come back to play in terms of that conflict and stabilization, right, and getting back to those young people who are more than half the world's population, and how they are impacted by these at the individual level and how those kind of aggregate up into community and national issues. So I'll stop there. I know we're short on time, but thank you and look forward to continuing.
Thank you, Nicole. So I'd like us now to sort of begin to slide into what I've been thinking of as, or describing as the solution part of the conversation. Obviously, it's an equally complex and broad conversation as is the challenges. I'd like to ask David Merrill, the president of the U.S.-Indonesia Society. David, you ran actually a large food security conference in Washington, I believe, last month. Maybe we could ask you to kind of set a framework here for what are the different parts of the solution set that the world is looking at to sort of begin to meet this challenge. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm going to agree with General Wesley Clark. It's always a good idea anyway, and he happens to be right. It's excellent to discuss the troubled state of global food security, but the task is, what is the world going to do about it? Now, we have come a long way. In the spring of this year, the G20 wasn't even sure that it wanted to deal with global food security. It said, this is a political issue. This is not an economic issue. And it took about 4 or 5 weeks for the G20 to come around to say, this is an economic development issue, no matter how much it's related to war. At this moment, maybe someone knows, I don't know, whether there will be a G20 food security communique. First of all, it has to be no objection by any member of the G20. So that alone means we don't know for sure, unless someone knows. But there are things that can be in it. First of all, the international organizations have to agree to do what they can. The multilateral development banks, the World Food Program, the FAO, the WTO, and others. I think progress is being made on that. I think it was made on that this summer during the multilateral meetings held here in Bali. On fertilizers, I don't know whether there will be specific recommendations on fertilizers. There should be, on increasing fertilizer supply, on the kinds of fertilizer, on how they should be used efficiently, and so on. There are many people in this room who are experts on that. Whether their ideas will be translated into G20 recommendations. So, a domestic supply response needs to be cultivated. And there should be, I think, and others do, some kind of mechanism created out of the G20 itself for some kind of forum for discussion of global food security, possibly chaired by Indonesia, who is in the best position to chair it. This does not have to be an organization that will dictate to others, but it has to be, in my view, an organization that can continue to examine and bring about solutions coming out of this G20 meeting. So I think that we need to build a bridge. There are those of us here who probably know how to do that, if it's not too late, to the G20 food security communique. Here we are in Bali. The meeting is taking place tomorrow or this week. And there's a lot of talent in this room. The principle that NGO suggestions should be looked at by official bodies is well accepted. So I encourage us to do everything we can to produce some recommendations for food security for the G20. Thanks.
David, thank you very much. Since you mentioned fertilizer as a key issue, which it most certainly is, I'd like to ask Michael Vatikiotis to my right here, who's a senior advisor for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue and has been involved in the Black Sea Grain Initiative on the issue of fertilizer, to maybe bring to the group a few of the ideas and initiatives that you've been working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam. First of all, just to echo Dave Merrill's very, very important points there, that G20 is an extremely good opportunity to actually bring forward ideas for supportive mechanisms on some of these key issues. I think, first of all, just to, because there's a lot of concern about the fallout from the uncertainty around the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I mean, let's first of all just say what it is. I mean, the main assumption was that if sufficient grain, and agricultural products were able to move into the world markets from, as we've heard earlier, a part of the world where most of it comes from, or a good part of it comes from, then global wheat prices, not so much just supply, but global wheat prices would come down. This in fact turned out to be true. In the weeks ahead of the actual agreement on July 22nd, and then actually following the agreement, the price rises that we'd seen after the invasion of Ukraine, in fact, stabilized, and these gains were erased by July. So that was the good news. Now, the difficulty is with markets. Markets are always jittery, and with the current agreement, even as Russia has come back into the agreement, the expectation of the market was that grain supply would be resumed fully, or at least efficiently, but that's not been the case. And of course, now there's the expectation or the worry that the agreement could be interrupted again, or its rollover and renewal affected by the situation on the ground. So prices are still the issue. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the grain supplies themselves have not necessarily been going to less developed countries. It's all about the price. And that brings me on to fertilizers, because of course the global price of fertilizers and the supply of fertilizers has been severely impacted. 70% of Europe's fertilizer production is now at a standstill. And that supply needs to be resumed. And that means ammonium nitrate from Russia through to Ukraine, also potash from Belarus. But I will just make a larger point, if I may, Adam, about, you know, to speaking to what we just heard from Dave about the need for support mechanisms for these kinds of solutions. I also feel, and I hope that in the following session after 2:45, after 3 o'clock, which I'll be moderating, we can begin to put some ideas down for consideration by the G20. It seems to me that many of these solutions are contingent and have not yet been well linked or coordinated. So the Black Sea Grain Initiative is great, but as we've heard in the room today, there are all these other issues that are affecting world food prices as well. A question I would ask is the WTO, UNCTAD, the FAO, and the WFP, are they all arranged in line to address the problems in a coordinated way? And that, I think, speaks to Dave's very good suggestion that perhaps there should be a mechanism for global food security. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. So there's a lot of interesting commercial innovation around the table that has been focused on addressing this challenge, and I'd like to begin to turn our conversation into that direction. I'd like to begin with Gaurav Srivastava. Your foundation has been looking at these issues quite intensively. Can I ask you to kind of begin with your thoughts on that subject?
Yes, thank you very much. It is, you know, there was a very important point you brought about price, and especially we are here in Indonesia, where it is a price-sensitive market. The important thing to remember, as we have heard, is food security and energy security is national security, and I think the tremendous work from the Minister of Defense in making Indonesia an independent nation in all forms of security has been tremendous. We're talking about two of the bread baskets of the world, Russia and Ukraine, right? And at the foundation, we have been looking at the correlation between energy and food, right? And it's important to remember, while we are working on these renewable energy solutions, which are critical, and which I think will address the needs in the future, there is a transition period. That is just the reality of it. And we have to regulate the energy that fuels the ships, that fuels the tractors, that fuels the cars, that will basically reduce or make the price more manageable. The other issue, which is an important issue, and I would like to turn to Pa Hashim after this, is the difference between how does the commercial industry work and how do policymakers work. And there is sometimes a disconnect between that. And given Pa Hashim's background in the commodity sector, I would like you to shed some light on that. And after that, maybe Niels, you can say a few words, if that's okay. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Pa Hashim.
Right. Gaurav, thanks very much. Yes, I just want to say just a few words. Actually, just in support of what Michael Vatikiotou said and David Merrill, that we are discussing food security, but actually, maybe the next time we should have it combined with energy, because as you both said, and then Gaurav also said, they're intertwined. You know, food and energy is intertwined, right? Higher energy prices impact food prices, impact fertilizer, and so forth. So I think that's basically what I want to say. I mean, I think some of the folks here on my left mentioned the impact on North Africa, on East Africa, and we talked about climate change. One small little aspect that I just want to add to what all of you folks have said. I think there's a demographic challenge in the future. We're talking about the near-term challenges, but there is a medium and long-term challenge, and that's a demographic challenge. I would call it demographic challenge. Except in Indonesia, agriculture is not a particularly popular profession for young people. And if you notice, in this island of Bali, most of the farmers are over 50, 50 years old, 60 years old, even approaching my age, 68. And if you notice that most of the young people in Bali, and I would say also in Java, they prefer to have work in factories, work in hospitality, in restaurants, and not particularly enticed by agriculture. So I think it's a long-term problem that we have, and I think it's not only Indonesia. I think it's other parts of the developing world. There's one statistic that some of you may know or may not know, is that actually Indonesia today is a majority urban society. 56% of Indonesians live in what are called urban areas. 56%. Only 44% of Indonesians live in rural areas. And even then, young people are going to the cities because they're more excited by city life and so forth. So there is a movement in Indonesia to what they call the digital agriculture, is to make agriculture more appealing to the TikTok generation, to the people. And a lot of Indonesians are much more familiar and much more comfortable with the digital economy, the TikTok generation. And there is a movement in Indonesia to try to get agriculture to be more appealing. But it's going to be, it's a challenge. And I think as we go from 8 billion to 9 billion to 10 billion, it's going to be a bigger challenge. So how do we keep the rural population in the rural areas, right? Producing the food. Okay, so that's, sorry, it's a long answer to your...
Thank you. Niels, you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Hashim. Thank you, Gaurav. I think we heard a lot about how we need to solve the food crisis and address the food insecurity in future, and whether that is through technology or like Hashim said, getting the TikTok generation interested in the agricultural sector. I think we also need to look at solutions that we can implement today. I happen to be in the fortunate position, or unfortunate maybe today. My company is active in both energy and agricultural commodities. And we see, and we spoke about this a lot now, we see a clear correlation between energy prices and food prices. It's been said by several people. We also see a clear correlation between increasing food prices, a shortage of food, and how that leads to uprisings and destabilization of our economies and our democracies. So we do have a responsibility to address that. Now, food security, in my view, at the end of the day, means food supply. We need to do something about increasing the supply and keeping the supply that we have today flowing to the market. And that brings us to the question of how can we get the actors in the industry to all work together. We have practical problems today that we need to address. The other day, General Clark and myself, we looked at supplying rice to an East African country. Everything is lined up, the transportation and everything, but we face an issue. That particular African country cannot open letters of credit. There is no financing available. And I think that's an issue that we really need to address. My company exports corn from Ukraine and wheat from Russia, but we face a practical problem. We'd like to bring this wheat to Sudan, to Yemen, to Uganda. Some of our friends from Uganda and Zimbabwe and DRC are here. We face a very practical solution. The ship owners do not want to load grain and wheat from Russia. The banks do not want to finance it, so it means that we have to finance it ourselves, and that brings us to a certain limitation. We can only do so much with our own funding, and that's the problem we face today. It's great to talk about future solutions, but today we have a solution already, and that means we need to get the industry actors to recognize that we all need to work together, that we need to make some difficult decisions. Treasury, the US government has been very clear. The oil and the food needs to flow to the market. There are no sanctions on food and energy exports from Russia, but yet the industry is self-sanctioning. And that has contributed to the shortage that we see today. I think that's an issue that we really need to address, and I hope that in the next 2 or 3 days we can all come to an understanding that we need to make the difficult decision, even though maybe politically we don't like it, but from a practical aspect, we need to say we need the food and the energy to continue to flow. How do we do that? By getting the ship owners, the banks, the insurance companies to recognize that we have a bigger responsibility than, how can I say, our morals, our moral ethics. We have, maybe we should, the biggest victim in all of this is, for example, Africa. We haven't spoken a lot about Africa. Every barrel of oil that now goes to Europe, because Europe can pay these higher prices, every cargo of grain that goes to Europe, which Europe can afford to pay these higher prices, does not go to Africa. That is an issue that we need to address, and we can only address that if we get the industry to accept that we need to finance these cargoes. We need to insure these cargoes. The ship owners need to be willing to go to the Black Sea ports. That's one thing that I'd like to throw into the group for us to think about. Another aspect that I think we need to recognize is that food and energy, as has been said many times now, are related. We need to address the high energy prices. Again, prices are dictated by supply and demand, so we need to do something about increasing the supply. The quickest way to bring prices down is to increase supply. It's very simple. How do we do that? By finding a mechanism to facilitate increasing oil exports. The G7 community has come up with the idea of maybe facilitating supply by introducing a price cap. And I think it will be an interesting discussion to see if there may be better alternatives to a price cap. There's all kinds of reasons why price caps may not necessarily be the solution. And I think it'll be good to see over the next couple of days if there are people in this room that can come up with better alternatives to a price cap. I think I'd like to leave it at this for now.
Niels, thank you very, very much for that. I want to just reiterate what I said at the very top, is that while we're sort of going around the room kind of picking people, I do want, if anybody does have a question, please do, or wants to make a comment, please do feel free to raise your hand, and I'd be happy to recognize you. Oh,
at the risk of coming in again, I want to thank Niels for his very practical comments, because what we have to, I hope, come out of this session with are the specific ideas that we're going to ask the G20 to take account of and hold nations accountable for. What the crisis in Ukraine, what Russia's invasion has shown, is that the world has changed today. A nation cannot invade another nation and jeopardize the food security for the entire world. It's simply impermissible. And we need to say that very clearly. But we also have to go to the captains of finance and industry and say it's no longer business as usual. It's not simply about your fiduciary responsibilities to your investors. As Niels was saying, there's a higher, this is what government should be about. Government should be about regulating, helping, foreseeing issues, and setting the conditions in which the private sector can work to maximize its profits within those constraints. And those constraints need to be modernized, because we're in a total global system here on food security. We're just seeing the first indication of it. So geopolitically, just to follow on something Peter was saying, in the United States, and I'm sure in Asia, people are very concerned about the future of Taiwan. Now, what could happen with Taiwan shipping in the South China Sea, where a third of the world's commerce goes through? And imagine what the impact of that will be on global food security. So I think, you know, it's a wake-up call now in this war in Ukraine. It's a wake-up call for the international community to really look at the consequences of globalization, of how it's affected each of us. And it's no longer sufficient, in my view, to say, well, it's up to the private sector. We'll let the Rothschilds decide, you know, how much credit they're going to give to the Prussians on whether they're going to get to invade France again. No, we're past the 18th and 19th century. This is the whole point of global governance. We've got to move toward a greater appreciation of responsibilities. Now, I hope then, Neil, building on what you will get other people here who are the experts to come up with their specific suggestions so we can take this forward and have something that G20 can really sink its teeth into on food security. Thank you.
General Clark, thank you for those remarks. I did promise to get back to some of the kind of the agricultural innovations that are happening, and some very exciting ones to deal or be a contributor to meeting the challenge of food security. Bakor Kfezareli and Erez Fait are both sort of in this space, and Erez, maybe I could ask you to start.
Okay, I'll start then. I'm Bakor Kfezareli, founder of Z-Tractor. It's a Silicon Valley startup. I would say, like, we need to invest more in startups. The one way to approach the technology, because startups have the advantage over the corporations to implement innovation and innovate as we don't have a switching cost. We don't have existing business model. We don't need to adopt our business model. We are starting big companies from scratch, and we have an advantage over the corporations to introduce smarter solutions, let's say. Another thing I would like to mention is that we are building autonomous electric tractors for agriculture. We want to build 25,000 tractors a year starting from 2025, and build on top of the tractors, build a network which will connect these tractors, where we will be able to collect real-time data. And the real-time data, we see the benefits of real-time data in the industries like aviation. Aviation is much safer, much more predictable with the real-time data collection. We see the real-time data in the postal and mailing services, which is convenience and efficiency and the transparency. And we see the real-time data in weather forecasting, right? We believe that the future of, we can fix many problems in agriculture field by introducing real-time data collection from the field, which is from tractor, from weather stations in the field, and so on. And this way, it can serve as early alert system. We can predict the future of yield. We can predict the crisis. We can predict the outbreak of the different pests and insects and so on. I think focusing on startups can be one angle of not completely solving this problem, but addressing the problems we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bakor. Eric, over to you, please.
Good afternoon. So far, we heard about the problems. I would like to talk about solutions. So we started about 6 years ago with developing autonomous system that irrigate and fertigate the crops based on the crops needs. You can think like a baby incubator. And because we believe that food security means self-independent production in every country, because we found out that the logistics become an issue, COVID, war, etc. And we have later on a session, but I would like to mention that the only way that we think to overcome the issue of education and the issue of knowledge is by technology. And I can say that the Minister of Defense left, but he was the action about 3 years ago, and we established a farm in Indonesia before the COVID. It was implemented during the COVID, remote control. It's still active, and it's produced more than 30 type of crops, indoor, outdoor, with great results. In parallel, we work in California, where there is drought, and we manage to grow things with no fertilizer and less water, etc. So we think that the way of solving the issue of agriculture is produce locally all the things that the agriculture needs. And this will shorten the cycle of logistics, because cost of logistics and distributing the knowledge to the remote area, like Mr. Hashim said, is the main issue. And we are working here together with the farmers, together with the universities, how to adapt this technology and bring back the youth to the circle of the production of the food. And the idea, especially in countries around the equator like Indonesia, is to grow food all year round, independent of the rain and other climate issues. And this is something that later on we can share and to see how we can help solving this kind of challenges. Thank you.
Aries, thank you very much for that. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes left, and I want to just sort of encourage anybody who has a comment to raise your hand. And before I could say it, ma'am, over to you, please. Can we have a mic in the middle of the left-hand row, please?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. My name is Gwen Mwaba from the African Export and Import Bank, and I'd really just like to first start by commending Neil for those comments that you made, which were top of mind for me. We are indeed facing serious issues with payments to Russia, where grains and fertilizer are coming from. And even though the sanctions clarify that they're exclusions, the self-sanctioning is a real problem. So, for example, an African Development Finance institution such as Afrexim Bank, if we try to make payments to Russia through our Western correspondent banks, they freeze those payments. So I'm wondering whether there's need to emphasize or clarify these sanctions, or for those sanctioning countries to issue notices, which we can share with our Western correspondent banks, so that they don't exclude payments that are related to food and fertilizers. That's one point. And then the second point is, again, the capacity of financing to African counterparties has been curtailed or cancelled altogether, as is usually the case when there's a crisis. And I think somebody did mention that it's not business as usual. So it's important that Western financial institutions, in times of crisis like this, don't pull back things like confirmation lines, because the price of energy and of fertilizer and grains has gone up, trebled and quadrupled. So that means there's more financing capacity in a trade flow where there's already an existing trade financing gap of billions of dollars. So we need that support from the West. And then my final point was really, even as we solve the problems, the immediate problems to get grains to these vulnerable countries, what do we do about the medium to long term? I think we also need to encourage investment into Africa for more production of food, but in order to produce more food, you need fertilizer. So perhaps investors should also look at partnering to set up fertilizer production plants on the African continent, so that there's more or less self-dependence on other nations. And I think then in the longer term, there'll be more food security for the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that's a topic that will be picked up in the following session. Thank you for raising it. Matt Kroenig, I think you raised your hand. Matt from the Atlantic Council.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Adam. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm learning a lot. I wanted to offer a framework for thinking about this challenge, because as I'm listening, it's occurring to me that that food security is not unique. A lot of these challenges we're facing are the same challenges we're facing with semiconductors, with energy, with PPE, with rare earth elements. And it seems to me that the common theme is that after the end of the Cold War, we built a global economy designed for efficiency, not for security. And that worked in a globalized, frictionless post-Cold War world. But now that geopolitics has returned, we realize that that doesn't work. We need secure supply chains. And so, when you look at energy, Europeans were too dependent on Russia. In the post-Cold War world, that worked. Now it doesn't. We are dependent on China for PPE. That no longer makes sense. Dependent on China for semiconductors. It seems the same when you look at the global food supply. 75% of human calories come from 9 food sources. We have a few breadbaskets like Russia and Ukraine producing. The rest of the world is importing. And so as we look towards solutions, it seems to me like some of the solutions here may be similar to the solutions in other areas. Diversifying supply chains. So instead of importing everything, more local production, millet in India, urea fertilizer in Africa, the diversity in terms of more biodiversity. So I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm seeing patterns, and I think maybe some of the solutions we're looking at in other areas of reshoring and ally shoring may make sense here as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. As we sort of begin to, without stealing too much thunder from the session to come, begin to think through what is it that we want this conference to contribute to the findings of the G20. Perhaps I could ask Ambassador of Ukraine to Indonesia, if you had some thoughts as to what, from Ukraine's perspective, what would you like the G20 to have to say on this food security issue, which will come up in a couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Actually, I was not preparing to speak in this panel, but since you asked, right, I just make some very brief remarks on what I think on that. First of all, I would believe that if you talk about the crisis, right, food crisis, whatever, logistic crisis, first of all, we have to identify the roots of the crisis to deal with it efficiently. And otherwise, it will be like, giving remedy to a person. Instead of giving remedy to a person like contaminated with something, just give painkillers. And the crisis will develop, and the human body eventually dies. So instead of giving painkillers, we must give the proper remedy after identifying what is the key problem. And we know what is the key problem. For all the crises, to put it in other words, rather than repeating that it is the Russian aggression, I would say that this is the global crisis of trust and diplomacy. We failed. United Nations failed, like League of Nations many years ago. So now, after UN is paralyzed, it's very important for the world to identify the group or whatever, group of world leaders who can work out the instruments and mechanisms of how to deal with the problem efficiently and from the roots, starting from the roots, right? So I hope, right? It's not that something I can know, but it's my hope that leaders of the world must act like leaders. They don't only have the rights to decide the destiny for the world economy and society and the directions for development, they also have duty to protect security, peace, development, prosperity of the world. And this is heavy duty. And in this situation, the world leaders, what I mean acting by leaders, they don't have to just discuss and trying to see, give the painkillers. Well, let's talk about the food crisis and don't talk about the war. No. If you act like leaders, you have to identify the problem and take immediate measures to nip it in the bud, to clean the body of a virus. This is essential. That's why, by the way, I was pleasantly surprised that this food security, Global Food Security Forum, is on the auspices of Atlantic Council and the Minister of Defense, which is very meaningful. If you want to resolve the crisis, like, you know, grain deliveries, as my colleague and friend, I would say, Ms. Kira mentioned, we are facing demining of the lands, we are facing the rebuilding of infrastructure, and we are facing the physical problem of protection of the farmers and of the deliverers, right? And this is the point where we apply something real. We apply the convoys for protecting the vessels, we apply the demining, and we apply the air defense to protect the actual silos and warehouses from the attacks, right? So this is very meaningful, and this is the point where the practical instruments can be applied. I mean the military. Unfortunately, living in the 21st century, having the small world where all the processes are happening like fast, anything happens, someone sneezes in the Latin America, someone, you know, coughs immediately in Australia, right? It's like, it's seconds, right? So whatever we do, it will influence the world, not just the region or not just whatever country. That's basically what I said. Act as leaders and try to be practical, not just theoretical. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Harniana, thank you very much for those remarks, and sorry to put you on the spot there. I wanted to give the last word again, actually the same question, but to some of our Indonesian academic colleagues who are here with us today in terms of your view of what you'd like to see come out of this conference in terms of food security from an Indonesia perspective. And again, I'm putting people on the spot here, which I apologize, but I want to at least give the opportunity to Rahmat Pambudi at the Bogor Institute of Agriculture or Eni Harmayani at Gadjah Mada University, the Faculty of Ag Technology. Again, don't feel obliged, but if either of you would like to comment, we would be happy to hear from you. Is there? They're not taking that opportunity because they're not here. So we'll pass here. Oh, yes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Eni Harmayani from Gadjah Mada University.
Thank you.
I think over the past years, there has been significant progress in boosting agricultural production. However, this has hardly reduced the number of hungry people and malnutrition. So I think eradication of hunger and malnutrition is an achievable goal if community at the local level are empowered. And also, as you asked, what is the output of this G20 in terms of food security? I think the international community must support the ability of each region to feed itself and to reinvest in local production. So the problem of globalization can be minimized because the regional area can produce their food by itself. So support by international community for the region to feed itself, I think it's very important. And combination of technology and also local wisdom is very important because human is the center of the development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Eni. I'm going to now give the last word to Gaurav. Maybe start us off, and I'd like you to maybe give us a few concluding remarks from your end. Thank you. Oh, please, sir, can we get a mic? We do have a few more minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Kasdi from the Ministry of Agriculture.
Right.
Yeah. So I would like, because one colleague has raised about the result of the agriculture working group here in Bali for several months ago. So the G20 agriculture working group just concluded and come up with 22 para of the communique, but unfortunately, only one communique, one para is not consensus by all the members regarding the geopolitical tension of Russia and Ukraine. But substantially, in fact, that we are going to come up with the 3 priority issues. First is how we can promote sustainable and resilient agri-food system. Within the situation is not, unpredictable here in the global situation. So agri-food system, dynamic behavior, we have to concern on that. So the secondly is about how we can promote an open, fair, transparent, non-discriminative of the agriculture trade. And this is all members agree that all the countries, especially who the center of the food production, is not allowed to restrict of export. This is very important, because if you do that, so the country within the very insecurity in food, that will be troubles. This all members agree with the export restriction should be avoided. The third is how to promote innovation. Everybody talk about the technology promotion, but we are focused on agripreneurship, especially for millennial people. That's just mentioned by Dr. Hasim. That is quite rare here in Indonesia, but we are now start how to train the millennial people in terms of the technology, because they are very fluently in the technology. This is why transformation of agri-food system is very important. So in terms of experience in Indonesia here, so we now facing the global food crisis. So Indonesia start with the policy and program how to secure on that. First, how to increase the production capacity of your food. This is very important. Especially for us here in Indonesia, we still imported 11 million tons of wheat from all over the world. 11 million tons. So that means 9 million tons for food, 2 million tons for feed. So it's very, 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 and I'm very glad to see that one of our colleagues raised about the cassava. So we are now focused on cassava, on sagu, on sorghum, should be substitute from the how big of food that wheat, for example, to import it. So we substituted to reduce of our import on the wheat. So secondly is how to develop of substitution of meat, for example. So not only of cattle, but we are also develop of poultry and so on. So that means that we have to try to find another alternative if you don't have any source of food on this country. So that's very important. The third is priority is about, well, in terms of the conclusion of agriculture working group in Bali, that export restriction should be avoided. So we try to have increasing production of any of commodity, because we have very diversified commodity here, horticulture, food crop, estate crop, especially on livestock as well. So we try to have, when we have more, we have to export it. So this is so we have 5 strategies here in Indonesia. So especially one that I mentioned already, how to increase our capacity production, promoting local-based food diversification. It's not only rice, because now we're increasing our production of rice. We have surplus already. 10.2 million tons we have a storage of rice right now. So we have tried to export it on that. So secondly is how to promote, to strengthen food reserve and logistics system. This is very important. Certainly modernization of agriculture, as everybody mentioned about the mechanization, machinery is very important, because you can reduce losses here in Indonesia. Losses is 11 to 12% of our harvest. If you do with mechanization, we can reduce until 5%. So that means you reserve of 7%. Our production is 54 million tons of rice. So that means, so when compared to the rice that start to cook, yeah, we have a 32 million tons. Every year we surplus about 2 million tons. So this is why our focus is how to increase production capacity, diversification product. It's not only the rice, but also the other source of food. Thank you very much.
Kasti, thank you very much. It's a very useful way to end this session and move us on to the next one with that emphasis on food resilience. Thank you very much. Gareth, did you want to just close us off briefly? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Not yet. There you go.
Thank you. I think the underlying theme of the conversation so far is we're all connected. All these events, food security, energy security, is all connected to ultimately national security and the stability of human beings. And the ambassador from Ukraine, he very well described the plight in Ukraine because of the conflict. We can take it one step further and remember that while we see the physical impacts of what's going on, these are multi-generational impacts, because once there is weapons on that land may not ever be able to plant again. They may not be able to grow any more crops again. And it goes back to remembering that countries in Asia, countries in Africa, their challenges are immediate, and we need to regulate those. And the risk is, if it is not regulated, the business that will go underground, and that creates a larger issue, which is it puts money in the hands of bad state actors, like Iran and Venezuela. And we definitely do not want that. But thank you so much for shedding the light on this conversation. And I think as we talk through this, I hope we can find a solution. And it is important to remember that we are the custodians of blessings and be able to pass it on from one generation to the next. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. Well, that brings us to the end of panel one of the Global Food Security Conference, and that leaves me as moderator with two final tasks. One is we will now have a coffee break for 15 minutes, and then we will reconvene back in this room for panel two. And the second task is just I want to thank all of you for your contributions to this very productive and useful conversation on this very important challenge, and ask perhaps that we all give ourselves a round of applause. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Welcome. The program will begin in just a few moments. At this time, we ask that you please silence all electronic devices and take your seats. Thank you. Welcome. The program is about to begin. Please take your seats. Welcome. The program is about to begin. Please take your seats. Welcome. The program is about to begin. Please take your seats.
hear me?
Sounds like it's working.
Okay, good. All right. Can those who are attending this second session please take your seats so we can begin? It's pretty much a follow-on from the session that my friend and former colleague Adam Schwartz just moderated. He ended up talking about a few solutions. What I'd like to do today, and first of all, let me just introduce myself. My name is Michael Vatikiotis. I'm reasonably well known in Indonesia, as I lived here before as a journalist. I now work for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. It's a Geneva-based conflict resolution and mediation organization. We've become involved in food security in quite a big way with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. But I'd also like to use this opportunity, and I firmly believe that, as has been said already in the room today, the G20 conference meeting of leaders is an excellent opportunity to focus global attention not just on the problem but also on action and solutions. And so what I'd like to do with the session today, because we will continue this discussion tomorrow, is to kind of draw up a list of ideas where they can be outlined or in detail that we can perhaps hope to get the attention of the participants in the G20. And in particular, I believe the Indonesian government, which is the host of the conference, if only because I know that President Jokowi himself has a real interest in the issue of food security, and I think it would be a real opportunity for him to say something meaningful, and for us to be able to contribute to, at least in a small way, a couple of initiatives that could be put on the table for discussion and end up being agreed upon. So that's an ambitious goal. But I would like to start by highlighting one of the things that I think has now become much more evident in terms of food security. And before I open the discussion, I'll just make this point, because as we've heard already today, there's a lot of discussion about the supply of wheat and grain. But now I think what's become very evident is that fertilizers are a key issue. According to figures that I've seen, even in a conservative scenario, the high cost of nitrogen fertilizers is threatening the global production losses of up to 66 million tons of staple crops such as maize, rice, and wheat. And this will affect at least 50 of the most food insecure countries, reducing the amount of crops they're able to grow, including here in Indonesia, not necessarily food insecure, but definitely reliant on fertilizers. So that's, I think, one issue that we should really try to bring to the attention of people here at the G20. In addition to that, we've heard earlier today the importance of trying to draw a closer link between water, food, and energy. I was recently in Jordan, a country that is now increasingly facing water stress. Syria, a country already in conflict, severe water stress that's generated huge numbers of cholera cases. It's linked to water, but also to food and to energy. And so I think one of the other things we might try to do is talk about how to strengthen or define and strengthen that nexus. And in that connection also, we might also want to look at, as we've already begun to, the two other issues that are floating around and hovering around food security, which is pandemic preparedness, because in the COVID pandemic, there was this move, as we've heard already in the room, to impose export restrictions as a sort of knee-jerk reaction, and there perhaps needs to be a mechanism to address that in the future. And then finally, climate security, which everyone tends to see as a sort of medium to long-term problem, which is already upon us, especially in the African continent. So with that, can I begin, please, with fertilizers, since it is an issue that has not been given a lot of airing, and I think it's an opportunity here at the G20 to really put that on the table. So I would like to first turn to my old friend Pak Hashim Joyo Harikusuma, because He's into organic fertilizers, which of course is one solution. But I would like him to perhaps help us frame the issue and maybe look at some of the solutions.
Thank you, Michael. It so happens that I had an interesting conversation with our colleague here, Pak Cassidy, who earlier addressed us with his remarks. And Pak Cassidy is the Secretary General of the Ministry of Agriculture. And he just gave you some tidbits, interesting tidbits about our fertilizer situation. I think Pak Cassidy said that Indonesia actually requires 25 million tons of chemical fertilizer, but we only have an allocation in our budget for 9. Pak Cassidy. So we actually have a budget shortfall for 16 million tons for chemical fertilizers, including urea and NPK. I was aware of this problem about 10 years ago, and I got very interested in actually starting some green, sustainable solutions. And one of them is actually the production of organic fertilizer. And organic fertilizer from degraded forests, Michael, from biomass, from woody biomass. Actually, my colleague, Dr. Willie Smits, is the one who got me interested in this. But there are other solutions as well. And one of the other solutions is the production of fertilizer from maggots. This is maggots from black soldier flies feeding on waste. And feeding on waste and feeding on garbage, but also feeding on the residue from, let's say, well, General Clark mentioned about the production of cassava. Only 35% or 28%, I think, of cassava actually becomes tapioca, and the balance 70% is waste, General Clark. That waste can actually be the feedstock, Michael, for black soldier flies, which in turn produce maggots, which in turn produce very lucrative, high-quality liquid fertilizer from, dare I say, the urine from the maggots. Okay, so I know it sounds a bit crazy, and I know I was a bit squeamish as well thinking about this, but actually there are many nature-based solutions, as Willie and Pakasi actually mentioned, nature-based solutions to the problem. So yes, we have a major problem, but there are solutions, and I am optimistic. I am optimistic because there are degraded forests all over the world, not only in Indonesia, but elsewhere, and we're talking about Africa. We have friends from our African colleagues who were here earlier, from the African Exim Bank. There is room for optimism, I think, ma'am. And that is that nature-based solutions, I'm convinced, is the wave of the future. Michael.
Thank you, Pak Hashim. So perhaps one of the things to perhaps sort of put on the radar of leaders is to start to explore those solutions immediately. I'm conscious also that what the immediate problem, of course, is the supply of particularly natural gas and ammonium nitrate, which is actually causing the production of fertilizers to decline drastically and for the price to go up. So I'd like to once again turn to Kira Rudik from Ukraine to talk about, because one of the keys to the supply and reduction of the price would be for a pipeline that actually runs from Russia to Ukraine and out to the Black Sea. So perhaps, Kira, if you could give us a bit more detail on that.
So I would like to make a general comment and support my colleague Vasil, Mr. Ambassador, in terms of us tackling certain problems. When we are talking about the pipeline and about the fertilizers, we are talking about a small part of the potential solution to the problem that would not fix itself. When we are talking about the issues that will arise in Africa, in all over the world, we, for some reason, omitting inevitable statement. There is war in Ukraine that was started by Russia, and it would not end by itself. It would just not. It will continue creating more and more issues for the whole world. And yes, there would be sanctions, and we will insist on them being stronger, because these are people who are coming to my land to kill my people. And yes, we will be working against all the transportation of ammonium through our land, because we want to weaken Russia, because we want them to stop coming and killing our people, our children, raping our women, and destroying everything that is there to survive. We are right now in this grain deal, which is a temporary, very virtual agreement between many parties. It's United Nations, Turkey, Ukraine, and Russia, that the transportation of the grains through Ukrainian ports and transportation of the fertilizers through Ukrainian pipeline continue. This is as fragile as I have already spoken to you before, for so many reasons. Just 2 weeks ago, Russia decided that they will exit the grain deal. Just by the one side, just early in the morning, they said, well, we are exiting. And as of right now, same as with the general question of the security, we are facing one question that we do not have answer to, is who or what in the whole world is organization or a leader that can make Russia stick to their words. It goes same with Ukraine and war in Ukraine. It goes same with keeping up with the energy supplies. It's going same way with the food supplies. And because there is nobody right now, there are no resolution. There are no security guarantees that could be put in place so there could be a peace deal. There is no way for the grain deal to be put in place and be signed by all the parties. You know why? Because neither UN nor Turkey nor anybody else can force Russia to execute to the word that they have given. And this is why inside Ukraine the deal is perceived as very virtual and something that would not last long. I think everybody at these tables understands how essential for the world food security this ability is. And I want to stress again how fragile every single path of every single ship right now is. It depends on the emotion, on the word, on unreliability of the country that is an aggressor and has been acknowledged a terrorist state by so many other countries. So when we are talking about resolving food security crisis, we must not close our eyes on the point that we must resolve security crisis first, because everything else that we will be doing, all the plans that we will be putting together, will be dropped by this one question: what or who will pressure Russia to keep their part of the bargain?
Thank you, Kira. And do you think that, and let me just follow up with a question, do you think that actually comes down to, because it's obviously in Russia's economic interests, to payments, to, I mean, in order to keep this issue of how to keep their word, to essentially assuring and ensuring the payments?
For the last 8 years, and I want to, again, inform everybody that war in Ukraine started 8 years ago. Right now it's just a full-scale escalation. For the last 8 years, the strategy of the leaders of the world was, let's have economic ties with Russia the way that they would be happy, that they would be satisfied, that they would be fed up, and then they would not have any intention or any logical reasons to attack. And then we will just make it too expensive for them to fight. Unfortunately, this strategy failed. So the economic ties with Europe and the reliance of European countries on Russia's energy and the billions of dollars that every single day are being paid by European countries to Russia did not stop them from attacking. Same way, having money flowing in and having payments being on time and open to them would not stop them from anything. And again, I'm talking from the history, and I have proofs to that. Every single day right now is a proof to that. 2 weeks ago, when they dropped off the grain deal, is a proof to that. But nobody can give me the proof of otherwise, that if they will have this assurance that they will continue going on and on this deal. we should not be emotional here, but be very logical and act with the historic facts. So as of right now, all the historic facts I'm using as the arguments to prove my point. Feeding the tiger and having the economic ties with it does not help and stop the empire of fulfilling on its imperialistic mission, expanding and destroying other nations.
Thank you, Kira. And I think that actually neatly encapsulates what the challenge will be for the G20 leaders, because there will be this argument on the table. But it still leaves the problem, which is, of course, the price of inputs is rising, and it is going to cause severe problems for food production in the coming year. So I'd actually like to turn now and get a perspective on this from Rahmat Pribadi, who is involved in the fertilizer industry, and to give it some perspective on exactly what is likely to happen if he's here. Yes, he's over there. Sorry.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Rahmat Pribadi. I'm the CEO of Pupuk Kaltim, which is the 5th largest urea producers in Asia Pacific. Pak Kasdi is sitting right in front of me. He's my boss. He's the president commissioners of Pupuk Kaltim, and we have Pak Panji, who's also director of our holding. So let me speak, allow me to speak on behalf of Pupuk Kaltim from the perspective of fertilizer producers. The issue in fertilizer is more on affordability rather than availability. Of course, availability is still an issue that we have to carefully watch what's going on with some export restriction from some countries. But I think the key is affordability. In the past, let's say 4 to 5 years, the affordability of fertilizer has shrunk. And it is worsened in 2022 because some issues in geopolitics and any other things. Just to give you a perspective, if you compare pre-crisis in 2022, the urea price has increased about 250%, whereas rice, the price of rice remains stable. Price before crisis and after crisis remain the same. So we are seeing now fertilizer becoming more and more expensive for farmer to purchase. And for that reasons, we've seen the decline of fertilizer consumptions globally is about 5%. But if you look at Asia, East Asia and South Asia, that number is even higher, that is 6 to 7%. That, I think, something that everybody has to be concerned about, like what Michael, you have mentioned. The decrease in consumption of nitrogen fertilizer will immediately impacting food production. So I guess to that perspective, I would like to probably propose if there is any initiative that this forum can take. I think we all have to work together to make sure that fertilizer price remain affordable for the farmer, especially in Asia where most of the farmers are small farmers. That can be done, I think, through subsidy, which Kasdi has mentioned, but again, Hasim mentioned that the amount that is needed and the fiscal capacity of the government does not match. So that is something that we have to look for the solution. For a country that is an agriculture country like Indonesia, who is at the same time also a gas producer, probably we have to also look at reducing the feedstock price. Natural gas price for fertilizer industry has to be maintained low so that the price of fertilizer, especially for small farmers, can be maintained at a level where it is more affordable. And I think when we are talking about export restrictions on agriculture product, which Mr. Kadi has mentioned in the previous sessions, I think that also has to include into fertilizers. I think the forum should push for a removal of any export restrictions on fertilizer. Hopefully, by doing so, fertilizer will be more affordable and the availability can be maintained. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Pat. So, we have a suggestion here that what should be considered is, if I read you correctly, Pak Rahmadi, a price support mechanism for fertilizer. Given the political obstacles to ensuring a more natural supply, then perhaps this is something that requires special attention here at the G20. And I want now to actually turn to Ambassador Dave Merrill because, you know, earlier in the first session, he talked about the need for the G20 to actually consider mechanisms to provide these kinds of solutions on a collective basis in ways that perhaps have not happened before. And I'm reminded that, of course, in one of the earlier G20 meetings during an economic crisis of 2008, there was a fund established which, you know, to address the economic crisis. And I'm wondering if we might want to look at ways in which the G20 could agree to special mechanisms or forums in which these kinds of things could be done. But Dave, over to you.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you, Michael. You've asked me to elaborate a little more, and I want to elaborate even more tomorrow, so I want to save a little bit for tomorrow. But here are some specific things that we think can be done. We had a in-depth session on this at U.S.-Indonesia Society, USINDO, September 9th. We had experts from around the world. Now, one is, of course, the financing of emergency food reserves and distribution. There was something done on that in some G20 meeting that took place this summer. I think it was among the finance ministers. And they, as you would expect, agreed that the multilateral development banks, WFP, FAO, WTO, etc., should do more. There's some kinds of facilities that they have in mind, and we'd like to hear more about what they intend to do. If there were a communique, which we don't know, we would think that would be part of it, building on what they did this summer with finance ministers. There need to be national and local distribution schemes, internationally coordinated food emergency reserves. I don't know what they did about that, but you would think that something would be done about that. And of course, encouraging NGOs and private charities. We're going to be talking about that tomorrow afternoon. Now, the NGOs and private charities can only do what they can do with what they've got. But if the world can get them a little more to work with, then they can do more. It's been mentioned about fertilizers several times. The fertilizer use is a problem. The fertilizer prices are a problem. We need to minimize trade barriers on fertilizer. We need to improve the liquidity of small and medium enterprises in national fertilizer value chains in lower middle income countries. We need to revisit security schemes for fertilizer subsidy schemes, for fertilizer to make them financially more viable, increase their impact, and improve the efficiency of fertilizer use to assist farmers to do more with less. There's a lot of technology going around to achieve more with less fertilizer, more efficiency of fertilizer. In fact, there's even one technology going around, I think there's a representative here, that does, from Israel, who does productivity increases with no fertilizer, just through selective application of water at the right time. So there's all kinds of technology increase, fertilizer, no fertilizer, that need to be redoubled, retripled, and everything else. Improving the productivity of small holders, growing staple food crops. That more or less goes without saying. But what should be done about that? What should be done to increase the yield, close the yield gaps for small holders with sustainability? If you can't have more wheat, you can increase the nutritional quality of diets. Programs for women and children, micronutrients, and so on, that can make what food you do have go further. These are fairly obvious prescriptions, but I don't think they've been written down. Promoting agricultural research. A lot of us have been involved for decades in agricultural research. Crops that would be resistant to climate change, higher yields on less land, and so forth. Now, guaranteeing affordable supplies of staple foods would have to be looked at either by the G20 or by someone else. Physical supplies, make sure that there's access via trade, and what we think there should be is some kind of G20 forum for food security dialogue. We're not saying that Indonesia has to be the automatic chair of it, but Indonesia is in a good position to chair a forum. It's not meant to be a new international agency, but a place to discuss these things going forward. And we think Indonesia, with its more or less neutral position internationally, has found itself in a great position to exert moral suasion and position itself to get the most out of the international community. The other thing that Indonesia's done in the past is rice. There was a rice crisis in 2008, I believe, and Indonesia acquitted itself well in the rice crisis. And so countries that eat rice, I know it sounds uncharitable, but if they ate more rice and less wheat, then the demand for wheat would be less, and then the price of wheat could ease up. And it shouldn't be impossible for, let's say, the Filipinos and the Indonesians to eat more rice. It's not objectionable to them. Of course, there's some that want wheat in their noodles, and maybe they have to pay more for the wheat in their noodles if they want the noodles that badly. But if countries can be who eat rice, I'm not sure where China comes out on this, because they eat rice and wheat. But if countries who eat rice traditionally can be encouraged to eat more rice, at least temporarily, it would ease the international demand for wheat and the price of wheat, in addition to whatever can be done with getting the ships out of Ukraine and everything on that front. So these are some of the ideas that we think should be encouraged by the G20. Now, in the form of it, I don't know. It's opaque to us. Maybe opaque to everybody, maybe it's not opaque to some of you. But how the G20 can do this, whether it's through moral suasion, whether it's through a communique, doesn't have to be a communique. If they can't have a communique, they can have something. They can have a speech, they can have a declaration of principles, or all kinds of things can. There are plenty of minds in this room that can devise the title of the document.
Thank you, David.
So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, David. Hashim, go ahead. Let's keep the discussion, and then Gaurav afterwards. Yeah.
I just want to say I'm a good friend of David, and just a devil's advocate, David. I mean, just to illustrate how complex the situation is. I don't want to diverge too much from the theme, which is food security. But I think we have a problem if you're asking people to eat more rice. There are two implications. One aspect is the health aspect, diabetes. I love eating rice. In fact, I had nasi goreng this morning. You know, but I think we have to admit that eating more rice with its glucose in the rice is a major driver of diabetes in China, India, and Indonesia. And I mean, that's one. Now, the second one is the climate change aspect. I've been told by experts, maybe Cassidy and others can enlighten us all, is that actually rice paddy cultivation is a major producer of methane into the atmosphere. And it's a contributor, a net contributor of emissions to the atmosphere. So that, you know, the whole thing is very complex, you know, and I just wanted to say that because I don't know whether increased rice consumption is the answer, frankly. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaurav.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Pahasham. It's important to remember. You know, my wife and I, she is Japanese American, I am Indian American. Culturally, we are coming from multiple cultures, and that's the beauty of the United States, is that you can come from anywhere and still be American. I think we're here to acknowledge the cultures and be able to work together. And as we're having this conversation, the more pressing question is, people are hungry right now. Yeah. They're not going to go to bed tonight with a full meal. We're going to have a coffee break with a couple watermelons and decide whether we want some more cantaloupes in it. It's a bit of a misnomer. So the question is, what do we do today? What do we do right now? And yes, the conversation today is Russia and Ukraine and the invasion, and it's a pertinent topic to be discussed. But Indonesia's philosophy, which David mentioned, of being neutral, is because Indonesia has a population that they have to feed. They have to run their cars, they have to run their bikes that require oil, that require food. And how do you regulate that? I think as we convene here, the question is, the mechanisms that are being put in place by the government today, do they regulate with what is needed in Africa, as the lady from the African Exim Bank said before? And does suggestions like the price cap that we have today, do they work? I think that's the more imperative question. Because it is okay to sit and pontificate on what's going to happen in 50 years, but the question is, I'm hungry right now. And I know, and I think Sharon can say, if I get hungry, it becomes, even for me, it becomes very difficult. Imagine a kid who hasn't eaten. So we have to really think about what do we do as thought leaders, and as we convene here to work from a policy point of view and from a business point of view. I think that's what I think.
Absolutely. I mean, one statistic that grabbed me was that just in September, food prices in Kenya increased 15%. And that's already translated into insecurity and rising criminality. So it's the impact on human security, not just stomachs, but also, you know, physical violence.
I mean, it is important to remember, you know, as we're sitting here, if the population is hungry, that is what gives rest to violence.
Yeah.
Violence that can destabilize whole nations. So, how do we work together with the two breadbaskets of the world, that is Ukraine and Russia, in a program that is regulated, whereby which the flow continues, but it is better monitored under a system. I think it's something to think about.
Yes, and you know, we've already got two nice ideas that are on the table that could immediately make some impact. One is the idea of financing for emergency food reserves, and then also this idea of a food security focused dialogue at the high level between governments, because that actually drives to the immediate needs for action. I'd like to come back, actually, if possible, to our friend from the African Exim Bank, because I thought she gave a very good perspective on the practical challenges of ensuring supply and affordability. So if you could come back again and give us some idea of what you think is needed, and what could be put on the table in this meeting over the next few days. Microphone, please. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, so please do introduce yourself.
Thank you. The name's Gwen Mwaba. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that we are doing for the African continent beyond the statements that I made around the immediate solutions is we've developed an Africa Trade Exchange whose purpose is really to aggregate the needs of Africa for grains and fertilizers so that we can approach suppliers on a pooled procurement basis. We did the same for COVID-19 vaccines during the time when there was scarcity for vaccines. So adopting the same model, we believe that we can bring the cost of logistics down through aggregation, and also the supply, because of the volume, will be higher than individual African countries importing by themselves. So this exchange is up and running. Now, the exchange primarily is meant to support the implementation of the AFCFTA. So the idea is that African producers of fertilizer would be supplying African buyers. And our statistics show that there is adequate production of the key fertilizers and their derivatives on the African continent. However, the supply doesn't always end up in Africa. And part of that reason is because the supply is being purchased by countries outside of the continent. So when we spoke to some of the larger suppliers in Morocco, in Egypt, and other African countries, one of the things they said is, yes, we have production, but we're tied into contracts of a year to 18 months. So one of the things we need is for some of those contracts to be released so that that fertilizer can be redirected to Africa so that for the next farming season, they can be, adequate production and increased production if we can't get fertilizers from the Black Sea region, where Africa is a big importer. In addition to that, obviously our institution will finance a lot of that production and supply of fertilizer. And we already have, we initially had $4 billion, which has already been consumed. So we need other international DFIs to come to the table to provide the financing that is needed to make these supplies available to the African continent. And I think the other points were made in my earlier intervention around what we might be able to do around sanctions immediately. But basically, so any support to the Africa Trade Exchange is very welcome. And finally, even though this exchange was set up primarily to facilitate the implementation of AFCFTA, during the crisis that we're facing because of the Russia-driven war, we are also reaching out to international suppliers globally, Western countries included, to participate on the Africa Trade Exchange, where there are supplies available for both grains and fertilizer, which can then be supplied onto the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'd like to come back to the ADB on this, because it might be something that could be, if you could follow up on that discussion on trade exchange and what could be done multilaterally in this region. Thank you. Jinfeng. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael. Again, after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine war, actually this May, one of the international financial institutions, we jointly formulate the action plan to address the food insecurity. One of the key actions is mitigating fertilizer shortage. So again, a number of the colleagues already mentioned about affordability and also the availability issues. This stage, affordability is a key issue because the last 3 years, fertilizer price tripled already, so the price very high. So one of the immediate actions, like what happened in Sri Lanka, the country already collapsed in terms of the financial stability. So what we did is with the WFP, FAO together, we quickly provide the social protection measures and also the budget support to help them to produce the fertilizer as quickly as possible. Of course, we also provide the working capital to those SMEs to help them to procure the fertilizer. I think the second measure is very, very critical to how to translate these challenges into the opportunity to say, because of we too much rely on the chemicals, probably in the future translate this policy change to the smart subsidy to encourage the efficient utilizers of fertilizer. At the same time, our colleague from Indonesia was mentioning about the electro-based solutions, like Winnie was mentioning about the Baicha, what is the good solutions. Finally, right now, ADB and also the IFC were also talking about in the future, probably not necessarily rely too much on the natural gas as a raw material of the fertilizer. We need to use probably a hydrogen as a source of the fertilizer as well. So we have the number of the solutions on the table, but fairly, again, I want to emphasize the smooth supply of fertilizer probably is the defining factor for the length and also of this food crisis. So it's very critical for the G20 have an agreement to ensure the smooth and free trade of the fertilizer. That is very critical. Let me just pause here. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, just as a general, go ahead, because I want to then go back to innovation and technology. But go ahead.
Well, I'd like to offer 3 specific suggestions, starting on the technology side. 10 years ago, the United States Agency for International Development was in Africa, in South Sudan and Tanzania, and pushing 2 technologies. One was a cassava that did not have to be cooked to be eaten. Normal cassava was 20 years supply in the ground. This only lasts a couple of years, but you don't have to cook it, so it made it much more accessible. Secondly, the introduction to Africa of yellow sweet potatoes as opposed to white sweet potatoes. Now, USAID was pushing this. What I don't know, and what I have, maybe there are experts here who know this, did it result in anything? Is there widespread, worldwide understanding that there's cassava that doesn't have to be cooked to be consumed, and that there should be no more white sweet potatoes in Africa? You need yellow sweet potatoes for vitamin A. So I don't know whether I don't know if we're propagating agricultural advancements correctly. And this takes me to the idea of agricultural extension services. In Angola, the Israelis brought their agricultural extension service to bear on a project in an abandoned Portuguese valley and brought in Israeli experts to talk about drip irrigation, to talk about how to price and develop for the markets, and it produced some exceptional results. But that system is not in place in many African countries, is what I'm afraid of. So I'm wondering whether one of the suggestions we can make to the G20 is that there should be a lot more emphasis on agricultural extension services. This is what's really produced America's innovation in agriculture. It's done by all the universities, land-grant institutions do it. Now, the second thing, though, about it is some innovations are protected by intellectual property. There was a lawsuit a few years ago against a farmer in Indiana, you may have seen this, where he kept the grain from the previous harvest and replanted it, and then it turns out, no, he can't do that because he has to buy fresh seed each year, and this was upheld by the U.S. court system. Obviously, there is some concern about if you take away intellectual property protections, you undercut innovation. But do we have the balance right? What's happened in the agricultural innovation market is firms have consolidated. And so Monsanto, for example, has a huge impact on corn and other grain innovation. Is there too much consolidation in this market at the expense of what's good for the public? And the third thing is the idea of strengthening the financial support for the World Food Program. So World Food Program can provide reinsurance coverage for the kinds of grain deliveries to countries at risk or in cases of conflict zone, so they can get in there and assure the owners of the vessels and the factors that they can be protected. So those are three ideas. I just throw them out on the table. I'm not an expert in it, but I've worked in the system enough to know I think there's something here, and I would invite the group to tailor this or accept it, reject it, or refine it in some way specifically, okay?
Thank you, General. Can I come back? Let me take two of these at least and maybe expand on them. The first on agricultural extension services. I mean, I was going to ask Eret Faiz because, you know, one of the things about nature-based solutions and technology related to that is the speed with which things can be conveyed to the farmers on the ground. And I see that as a problem because in many parts of the world, it's actually quite difficult to convince people to abandon their traditional practices. So please, could you...
Okay, first of all, you're right. It's like almost changing religious, almost. Because farming going from experience of the ancestors, and actually farming doesn't change almost 10,000 years. Only technology improve. We have pivot, drip lines, but the practice is the same, so we apply the same amount of water and same amount of fertilizer. We came, and thank you, General, for mentioning some of the technologies, but we are coming from a different approach as a company. of education the farmer, because technology without education and proving doesn't work. People need to adapt. So we started in Thailand. The Minister of Agriculture invited us to take 1 hectare of abundant paddy that was meant to grow only rice, and we managed to grow almost 7 to 10 type of crops. Next to me sitting Ouija, that is local partner that actually managed a project that started by Minister of Defense 3 years ago. And the minister was practical, make decision, let's do, let's not talk, and to move forward. And we established a 5 hectare project where we grow more than 30 type of crops, indoor, outdoor, and we prove locally the new practice of growing rice only with 20% amount of water, no swamp, no methane, no weeds, and no germination and replanting. And we did the same for corn and other crops. And the beauty is that everything was run by a local team that was trained remotely because of the COVID. And we have the same in California, the same in New York, the same in Morocco now. So when we speak about government, like government provide health and provide education, and education health doesn't have ROI on the other side, because it's usually obvious that government need to provide health and education and security. So I think I have seen it also in Vietnam. I recently have meetings with Vietnam, and they provide the farmers with the infrastructure because they understand that if they will build the greenhouses and provide the water and electricity education, the farmers grow more and they pay tax. And by paying tax, this become, instead of vicious circle, it becomes a positive circle. And we can continue, and I would like to give Ouija that he is coming from different field. He is coming from defense, from other background, and now we join together to change this ecosystem for good by doing it available. And again, it's not more expensive, it's less expensive, because we are talking also with DFC and the US government to build locally the technology. If it's a drip line, if it's the facility, and then the logistic is much easier. So government can finance the infrastructure to the farmers, and then from the tax that they are paid, you can deduct it. Ouija.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Eres. Thank you, Michael. Pak Asim, allow me to talk. I would like to resonate 3 things, Michael, if I may speak on behalf of this G20 discussion. Let's promote our G20 communique in a global food security solution by having, one is about technical provision. I learned a lot from Israeli company, from my colleague here, Mr. Eres, from the project that initiated by Mr. Prabowo, my Minister of Defense. But the problem is this technology is only available in his country, whereas our country doesn't have diplomatic relations. So I have to go around 3rd country, 4th country, 5th country. You know the result, transshipment, more cost. So we need to find a solution. That's why I encourage, while Pak Hashim is here to talk with his brother, to promote this initiative into G20 communique, how to do the agriculture technology provision from a country like Israel to Indonesia. Number 2, for the TikTok generation, and also about the farming practices that you mentioned, in our area in Cisaat, only young, I'm the oldest, I'm 52, the rest is young people. They do the farming with the phone, they do the farming, the control with internet. So we make it sexy, we make it more hype, Pak Asim, TikTok generation, you're right, Pak. So if you come to my farm, you will no longer see old farmer, Pak Michael, but young people, I promise you. The third is financial inclusion. I would like to promote also, because the problem is, when I went to South Sulawesi, Central Java, most of the farmer doesn't have big land, Pak. Small portion, 0.5, 0.2. How do we incorporate this? The next guy here from ADB, they must have learned from some head of agencies or municipal here in Indonesia to promote also this kind of initiative, having strong support from a financial institution like ADB. G20, I believe, is a good opportunity, Pak Michael, to talk about this. Last but not least, about incentive, or I call it less imported restriction. In my experience, to import agriculture technology stuffs, the tax is crazy, Pak, let alone the fertilizer. So we need to tell the government, don't only impose tax for us. You can grab another revenue from the selling of the harvest, as Mr. Ares just mentioned, in other countries. So this four angle, I would like to propose and to be discussed further tomorrow. I believe Ares has his session tomorrow. Be more than happy to do the testimony or some conference. Thank you, Pak Michael.
Thank you, Pat. This is very useful input. Now, I mean, we have two, in a way, we have the technology side, and my concern there is the speed with which technology can be used to alleviate the problem. But then we have, as we just heard from earlier, about the question of financial support for WFP. And on the question, I mean, finance, it seems, is the short-term solution. And I'd like to ask Niels again to come in on this, because you have a very practical experience. And then, Gaurav, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I think it's important to take the discussion back a little bit to what we can do immediately. And I think it's great hearing possible solutions in the field of innovation, which is all great, but I think that will bring solutions in 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But today, we have people starving, literally starving in Africa. And I think Kira made an interesting comment about Russia pulling out of the grain deal. And one has to wonder, why did Russia pull out of the grain deal? My understanding was that they were unhappy with the fact that many of those shipments did not end up in the country, in the continent that needs it most, which is Africa. So then we have to ask the question, why do these shipments not go to Africa? And the reason is that the grain prices, it's affordability again. The prices are too high for Africa to be able to pay it, and Europe can pay those high prices. And the second issue is that financial institutions are not willing to finance these shipments from Russia because of self-sanctioning reasons. And I think if we want to look at an immediate solution, we have to take this discussion beyond geopolitics and really look at practical solutions. Even though it may be difficult to accept morally, I think we may have to come to the conclusion that we have to cooperate with the largest food producer in the world, the largest food and energy producer in the world, which is Russia. Now, that may be morally a very difficult decision to take, but I do think as world citizens, we have that responsibility and look at how can we practically help, for example, the African continent. And I think for me, one of the practical solutions is to look at self-sanctioning. You know, why are we self-sanctioning, and should we be self-sanctioning? Do we not have a moral obligation to help those in need? So that's one thing that I wanted to focus on. And I think if we can convince the financial institutions that are part and parcel of this industry, the fact of the matter is we cannot, as trading companies, finance these cargoes ourselves. The financial requirement is simply too large. We need the banks to start opening letters of credit again. We need the banks to say, yes, we do have a moral obligation to bring food and energy to the world. And the same applies to the insurance companies, same applies to the shipping companies. One of the comments that was made is about the importance of fertilizers and the affordability of it. Affordability, of course, is price. The largest fertilizer producers are based in Belarus and Russia. And we have been sanctioning some of those producers and also self-sanctioning. So I think, again, we need to address that. We need to look at that. Do we really want to do that? If we want to bring the price down, the fact is you have to increase exports. It's as simple as that. And again, these are difficult decisions to take morally, but we do have, again, I'd like to stress it, we do have a bigger responsibility to bring fertilizers to the world and bring energy prices down. Again, fertilizer prices are closely linked to energy prices. So if we really want to bring prices down and make food and fertilizers more affordable, we have to look at increasing energy exports and reducing self-sanctioning. So these are just the points that I wanted to emphasize.
Thank you, Niels. And I know that a lot of people some people want to put more proposals on the table, which is great. Sharon, I think you wanted to speak. We need a microphone over here as well. Sorry. Just but while we're getting ready, Niels, that's a very good point. To your point about the moral, and Russia being the largest producer, surely that's a question of leverage as well. There needs to be a trade-off here where supply, but it comes with leverage, and in terms of making sure, holding to the agreement, and who has that leverage. But we'll come back to that.
I think the question is, there is we need to find a solution on how to work with two bread baskets, given the interconnectivity of food and energy. But there's another issue which I would like to circle, which is we're talking about agriculture, and in most countries in Asia and Africa, agriculture is done by women. And women and children are the ones who bear most of the flack for this, with the conflict in Ukraine, with what's going on now. And maybe Sharon wanted to say a few things on that.
Thank you. Just in sitting here and listening to everything, I see it as like there's a current situation, which was the reason why we wanted to hold this in the first place, because we saw how fragile the energy and food connection is because of these bread baskets being held up in the world. So I think a good way to look at it is that's the current immediate situation that we need to think about how to deal with. And then there's the future solutions and situations, which include the new technologies, the TikTok agriculture, and that comes down to the agency of human spirit, I believe, which is what someone here mentioned. How do we think about empowering individuals in their own countries to grow their own food? And how do we enrich the soil for those endeavors? Someone mentioned roots, fungus growing on roots, and other solutions to being less dependent on exports and imports for their nations. I think that the other point, to your point, is, as Nicole mentioned, there's a disproportionate effect that food insecurity has on women and young people. And we've certainly seen that in our travels in Asia and Africa, where women are really at the forefront of trying to feed their families. So one thing we can think about are what are the laws that are in place that either support them to building, food security for their communities, or that disadvantage them. Can they own their own land? What are the inheritance laws around farming? Can they get business loans? I think someone brought up, the loans, Exim Bank. How do we think about empowering those women who are really at the forefront in many ways of feeding their communities? And of course, education, because even if we do have the new technologies and we invest in those new technologies, how do we educate these women? And a lot of them are female farmers. Like, that is the reality. And how are we thinking about that? I think it's a really important thing to think about in our discussions.
Thank you, Karen, for bringing it down to that very human and vital level. Thank you. Fred, you had a proposal.
I think these things more from a geopolitical standpoint. So I'd make two proposals for the G20, or maybe in general, maybe this is even for the United Nations. But it seems to me that we should, and this gets back to what General Clark said in the first session, which has been tweeted out and is getting some traction. Your quote, General Clark, "A nation cannot invade another nation and jeopardize the food security for the entire world. It's simply impermissible." So why not weaponize, why not make it an international crime to weaponize food security and hunger? Now, calling things an international crime has done nothing to stop Putin so far. But on the other hand, for it to be there to make clear that this is beyond the pale of what the international community can accept, I think would be useful. The other thing is countries, because of the fear of rising prices and food insecurity, applied export bans, which made the food insecurity worse. India on wheat, others on palm oil, others on fertilizer products. So I think the G20 could agree that they would, as a group of 20 countries, leading countries of the world, agree not to engage in agricultural export bans. And so I think these two geopolitical factors, because let's not kid ourselves, the reason we are where we are right now, which is the World Food Program called it the worst food crisis in modern history. The last one was 2008, 2012. We've got 300 million people on the edge of disaster, 800 million people in food insecurity that weren't there before the war in Ukraine. And so I think it's really, at a time like this, never let a crisis go to waste. This is the time for the G20 to put some signals in the ground of a geopolitical nature. And then I really liked Hashim's nature-based solutions, which didn't get on anybody's list. And so I think nature-based fertilizer solutions, I mean, this is a little bit beyond the geopolitical issues, but I would put that on there as well.
Thank you, Fred. Yes. At the back there, thank you. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Willing Ghana from DRC. Yeah, I just want to add on the point of empowering women on the farmer, because I think that is very, very important, especially in Africa. If you look at how farming are done in a traditional way, the issue, the challenge that people are facing there is huge in terms of the capacity, also access to finance. Access to finance is a big issue because in many cases, finance are not there and banks are not there to support those farmers, especially the small farmers. And also, in terms of capability, they do not have much capability to really improve the productivity of their land. You know, they have limited, and most of them are doing it manually. So the technology, the capability are not there, and also support are not there. So one of the things that when we look at what we can do quickly to really see the impact of those people, I think is about empowering them in terms of technology, in terms of access to finance, and that's very, very, very important. In this respect also, I think when it comes to policy maker, the policy maker has a big role in terms of how a country is willing really to support the agriculture, how the country is willing really to eradicate the food security. And those are the things that, you know, in terms of quick win that we can implement and do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm from East Africa, and I just wanted to add on the point that Niels brought on the table, talking about the impact on Africa. So obviously Africa is a continent of 1.2 billion people, and the impact on food security has been huge. Just going back to the point that Niels made, the geopolitical nature is that you have a double whammy where not only does Africa not have the supply side of the food, you know, the wheat, the rice, everything. And because of the sanction, the self-sanctioning that was talked about, Africa is not able to access not just food, but fertilizers as well. I can tell you that I'm personally involved right now in trying to get fertilizer into Kenya. In Kenya, they have the short rains that come in December. And right now, they weren't able to access the fertilizers because, one, because of the sanctions on getting fertilizers from Russia, and two, the credit lines. The financial institutions aren't willing to provide the credit lines to bring these fertilizers and the food into Africa. Then the third aspect of that is obviously that you then have a drought. You've got the environmental aspect of it, which obviously nobody's talking about here because we're talking food security and we're talking about energy. But you've got a huge drought. The wheat that went into Djibouti and Ethiopia, there's thousands and thousands of people starving, who don't have access to food. Now, when you talk about the fertilizer problem, not only don't you have that food coming into Africa, but now the farmers who are going to actually grow food, talking about the short rains that I talked about coming in December, we won't have that fertilizer in December. So again, you've got the food that should have been grown locally, not being available for people to eat, creating even more hunger. So I think this is a very, very important forum to bring these particular issues to, and see if some of the talent that we have in this room are able to bring this to the G20 and specifically talk about this problem in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I sort of begin to sort of summarize some of these proposals, I think we had one more over here, and then I'll turn to Matthew, then I'll summarize, and then you can close.
Great. Is this on? Yes. I'll be quick. Just picking up on some of the comments that have been made about financing and financial inclusion, and a contextual / sort of policy proposal point didn't come up this morning, is predominantly in the aftermath of, or exacerbated by the pandemic, is the issue of debt. We are seeing increased debt at the sovereign level, at the country level, as well as at the corporate level and even at the SME level. The IMF has warned of non-performing loans and a debt crisis really at all levels. So when we think about the financing solutions and the financing challenge and the access to credit and opening up those credit lines, and even financial inclusion and microfinance supporting small, medium-sized enterprises and smallholder farmers, I think we need to keep that context and what that means as far as thinking about innovative financial solutions that are also operating and can address that debt issue and that reluctance, whether that's debt swaps, whether that's thinking about blended finance, and even getting into some of those microfinance. So just wanted to make sure that we're linking in the debt agenda, which is on the G20, and when we're bringing the food security and climate finance into it as well, that we are linking to that overall kind of sovereign and macro debt crisis, because that will be on the agenda of the G20 as well, and we can tap into that, into those solutions.
Thank you, that's useful. Matthew.
Two possible solutions, one short-term and one longer-term. We heard from several of our colleagues in the private sector that one of the challenges here is that banks are unwilling to provide financing because they're afraid of falling afoul of Russia sanctions. And so I think one solution is education. There's always humanitarian carve-outs in US and international sanctions, but educating the private sector about that they can facilitate flows of food without falling afoul of sanctions, and that's something that think tanks or universities, others around this room can contribute to. Longer term, in the last section, I said that part of the problem, I think, is we become too dependent on too few suppliers providing too few food sources. It seems like a lot of what we did talk in the second section was about diversifying sources of food supply, providing financing, providing technology to increase domestic production, African fertilizers, for example, introduce new food types like yellow sweet potatoes. And it's not a concrete solution, but in terms of a strategic framework, it seems like diversifying sources of supply so you're not so dependent on any single source is an important part of the solution.
Thank you, Matthew. Hashim, quickly, and then, yep, please go ahead, Hashim.
I think one of the things that we haven't really found a solution, or perhaps a proposal for a solution on the payments problem. We're talking about nature-based solutions. Thank you very much, Fred. I mean, that's a medium to long term, right? But as Niels and Gwen have said, and our friend from Kenya, East Africa, you're facing an immediate problem. December, you need fertilizers, right? And the problem is there's a lot of money which wants to go and send to Russia, but banks don't want to facilitate the transfer of payments. That's the problem. And so I think what we can do is maybe there's a short-term solution. We have a friend from the Development Bank. Perhaps there's somebody from the Inter-American Development Bank, maybe from the African Development Bank. Can those multilateral institutions, can they facilitate the payment? Can they open the LCs? Can they guarantee the LCs without fear of retribution from AFAC, right, from the Treasury Department? I can tell you for a fact that Indonesian banks are deathly afraid of phone calls from the U.S. Embassy. You know, I mean, they've told me they've had phone calls from the U.S. Embassy representing AFAC from the Treasury Department, making sure that Indonesian banks don't open LCs to Russia. Okay, so this is something that I think has to be. Maybe we can address it in a few days' time at G20. Maybe the multilaterals can open the LCs. Maybe the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development can open the LCs. Maybe the European Investment Bank can open the LCs. Perhaps our EB, Asian Development, can open the LCs for people like Niels or others, you know. So I think maybe that's the short-term solution. Yeah? A neutral multilateral institution and not too phased by nefarious activities by the Russians. At least it's for humanitarian. We open and they open the LCs to Russia just purely on humanitarian grounds. Nothing, you know, I mean, not as a bias for the Russians or otherwise. That's a short-term solution, maybe, I don't know. But maybe our friends from the multilateral institutions can tell us.
Thank you. Gaurav.
I think, you know, Hashim, you made a very important point here. And the crisis here is immediate, and it needs to be addressed. But while we are having this conversation, it is also important to remember that we're not condoning anything here. But it is more to create accountability and let the trade flow. Let accountability happen under a proper program where systems can be put in place so that self-sanctioning doesn't happen, so that the governments can work together. And that's really what this is about. And it's about creating a program of accountability between all the stakeholders. That is Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and other members of the G20 that can work together to find a solution that makes everyone accountable for better solutions. I think that's the goal.
Thank you. General, I know you wanted to quickly jump in, and then I have to summarize.
What Gaurav and Hashim and Niels are pointing out is absolutely essential. We don't want to self-sanction in such a way that we're depriving the world of food because of Russia's military action. However, while we argue against self-sanctioning, if we're going to call for that, I think we have to stand forward and say Russia should pull out now. I mean, if we don't say it in the name of food security, who's going to say it? This is not really about U.S.-Russia. I'm sorry, I'm a former general. I know you probably think, oh, here he is trying to get mad at Russia and stuff. I'm not. I'm just observing a very obvious point. The immediate cause of this crisis, as we've all said, is a Russian unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It is impermissible, and I would just like to humbly make the suggestion, the first finding of the conference should be, Russia, stop the invasion, pull out, let Ukrainian farmers plant their crops, demine, etc., and then we can also resolve the sanctions with Russia. So I think, you know, before we go after self-sanctioning, we have to state the obvious. This is on Russia.
Thank you. So I know we've sort of run out of time, but I did promise that what I would do is try to summarize and capture, rather, some of the suggestions that were put on the table at this session today that we might want to take forward in the stakeholder discussion tomorrow in more detail. And as I saw them, heard them, I think it comes down to 5 or 6 suggestions. First, financing of emergency food reserves. And I think, I'm going to try and put emphasis here on the immediate needs. So that's the idea that there should be a mechanism for financing emergency food reserves. And that sort of falls, I think, on many of the governments in the G20 and the multilateral organizations. The UN will be there. The second would be a G20 forum for food security dialogue, which doesn't obviously address immediate problems, but begins to create a mechanism for anticipating that these kinds of problems are going to be with us for some time and need special attention. The third, which I thought was very nicely put by Gwen from the Exim Bank, which is the idea of a trade exchange to aggregate the needs so that the costs can be brought down. And I think this is an idea that perhaps should be extended to many other parts of the world as well, particularly in this part of the world. And fourthly, agricultural extension services. This gets into the realm of something a bit longer term, but obviously vital. And under that would come the whole raft of innovations and nature-based solutions. I mean, as someone who's been recently working in East Africa on some of this climate change-related issues, one of the problems is actually persuading communities that are rather isolated and it really is about extension, of the need to, for instance, grow crops in a different way to address and mitigate the impact of climate change. So it's very, very important. It's just not immediate, but it has to be done. And then we come on to the very important issue of finance. We heard one suggestion, finance support for WFP and grain delivery, but I think I do hear in the room a lot of voices calling for a better way to mobilize in this very complex and sensitive geopolitical context some way of finding the financing for obtaining the vital inputs to agriculture. And I very much, and I'll just sort of capture it in one sort of phrase, I like the idea of this humanitarian mobilization of payment facilitation. And it makes sense to me as someone who's worked in the humanitarian field that we do all sorts of things to to adapt to difficult circumstances in the humanitarian field. Well, why not do payments as well? And it's something to think about. And at this point, I will hand over to Matthew, and I hope this has been a useful discussion. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael. I'd just like to say a few words to adjourn the session today and conclude the first of 2 days of the Atlantic Council's Global Food Security Forum. I was introduced earlier. I'm Matthew Koenig. I'm the acting director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. We lead the Atlantic Council's work on food security because we do see it as a real security challenge. It's been a pleasure joining you today for this rich set of discussions on global food security challenges and opportunities. I learned a lot. I found it useful. I hope you did as well. We talked about some of the challenges, climate, COVID, conflict, some of the solutions, global governance, financing, technology. Michael did a brilliant job of summarizing those for us just a moment ago. But this is just the first step. As you know, we're going to come back tomorrow for a large public conference. We invite you all back here at 8:15 a.m. Bali time, 7:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the second day. And we're going to continue to build on some of the solutions we've identified today. So we have a terrific lineup for tomorrow. Experts and officials to appear include Indonesian Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto, U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Ambassador Cindy McCain, Desi Anwar from CNN International, and many more. So we hope to see you back here tomorrow. Let me again thank our forum co-hosts, the Ministry of Defense and Coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Investment of the Republic of Indonesia, Gaurav and Sharon Srivastafa. Thank you, Sharon and Gaurav, for making this possible. And thanks to the moderators of our session, Michael and Adam, who did a terrific job. And thanks to all of you who came to participate today. Thanks to all of you, the hundreds of you watching online. And to those of you who are here in person, you don't need to go home. We're going to have a reception to immediately follow in the Cucina restaurant just downstairs. So if you're interested in joining us, just find the staff with the black lanyards and we can lead you to the reception. We look forward to continuing the conversation over drinks and again to seeing you tomorrow. So again, thank you very much, and we'll see you back here bright and early tomorrow morning.